Harold had always believed that some things were too small to be bothered by, too innocent to cause trouble. But that morning, as the crisp autumn breeze rustled through the trees, a sharp click of heels on pavement, shattered the calm. Mrs. Jenkins, clipboard in hand, approached with the same determined look she had worn during every HOA meeting. But this time, she wasn't just stopping by for a friendly chat. She was carrying something much more dangerous than a piece of paper. She was carrying the weight of a $500 fine. And that was only the beginning. What Harold didn't know was that his peaceful act of feeding the ducks would soon thrust him into a battle that no one saw coming. A battle not just for the ducks, but for the very heart of his community. The conflict would test everything he believed in: nature, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. In a quiet neighborhood nestled on the outskirts of a sleepy town, a retired teacher named Harold had found solace in his peaceful daily routine. Every morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold, Harold would step outside onto his porch with a bag of premium duck feed, a gift from his late wife, a fellow animal lover. The pond at the back of his property was his little sanctuary, where he fed a small group of ducks that had made it their home. He would sit there for hours, watching the birds waddle about, feeling a deep connection to them. It wasn't just feeding them, it was his quiet act of preservation, something that had become a ritual over the years. Harold had been a man of few words, content with the simple pleasures in life. His wife's passing had left a hollow space in his heart, and these moments by the pond were his refuge. But little did he know, this peaceful routine, this small act of kindness, was about to unravel his life in ways he could never have imagined. It wasn't long before his neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, known for her stern, no-nonsense approach to neighborhood rules, began to notice Harold's daily rituals. She didn't mind the ducks at first, but something about Harold's quiet, solitary moments began to trouble her. She believed in rules and regulations, and Harold's peaceful feeding of the ducks seemed to her like an act of defiance. What began as a simple, innocent act of nature soon became the target of scrutiny. But what Mrs. Jenkins didn't know was that Harold wasn't just feeding ducks, he was unknowingly becoming part of something bigger. It was a crisp autumn morning when Harold's routine was interrupted. The distant sound of heels clicking against the pavement signaled the arrival of Mrs. Jenkins, her presence always as inevitable as the changing seasons. She marched up to Harold's porch with a determined look on her face, clutching a clipboard in her hands. "Harold, you can't keep feeding these ducks," she said sharply, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at the birds pecking happily by the pond. Harold, who had lived his entire life following the rules, was taken aback. He never imagined feeding the ducks would cause such a stir. "It's just ducks," he murmured, confused, but Mrs. Jenkins wasn't listening. She proceeded to recite the Homeowners Association, HOA, rule that prohibited feeding wildlife, something he'd never heard of before. She warned him that he could be fined $500 if he didn't comply. Harold was stunned. He had spent years enjoying these moments, and now, his peace was being threatened. But it wasn't just about the fine, it was the sudden intrusion into a place that had been his sanctuary. His heart sank as he realized the world he had carefully built was under attack. The air felt colder as Mrs. Jenkins continued her rant, oblivious to the emotional toll her words were taking. Harold wasn't just upset about the rule, he was deeply troubled by the idea that something so pure, so simple, could be disrupted by a piece of paper. But something inside him stirred. He wasn't just a man who followed rules. He was someone who had spent his life helping others, teaching students the value of standing up for what's right. And now, Harold was being asked to choose between the rules of his neighborhood and his conscience. Harold stood his ground, a glimmer of defiance in his eyes. "These aren't just ducks, Mrs. Jenkins. They're protected species." "You don't understand," he said quietly. He had learned that these birds were part of a federally protected species, a fact that had come to his attention after he had started researching the local wildlife. In that moment, Harold realized something profound. His small act of kindness wasn't just feeding ducks, it was an act of preservation. By feeding them, he was playing a crucial role in ensuring their survival. As the days passed, Harold couldn't help but reflect on the deeper meaning behind his actions. His connection to these ducks wasn't just about nostalgia or sentimentality, it was a reminder that nature, fragile and beautiful, needed to be protected. He thought about the lessons his wife had taught him about the importance of preservation, of standing up for something greater than oneself. The more he watched the ducks, the more he understood that these creatures weren't just part of the ecosystem, they were a symbol of all the things worth fighting for: compassion, nature, and the preservation of life. But as Harold stood by the pond, observing the ducks, he realized that this wasn't just his battle. It was a battle for the soul of his community. If the HOA could so easily dismiss the importance of protecting these birds, what else could they undermine? It became clear to Harold that the fight wasn't just about the ducks, it was about standing up for something pure and good, something that transcended petty rules and regulations. As the weeks went by, Harold and Mrs. Jenkins found themselves at odds more frequently. The conflict between them deepened, with each side growing more entrenched in their beliefs. Harold saw Mrs. Jenkins as a symbol of cold bureaucracy, someone who valued rules over life itself. Meanwhile, Mrs. Jenkins believed that Harold's defiance was a threat to the harmony of the neighborhood, and she couldn't understand why he couldn't see that. But as Harold continued to fight for the ducks, he began to wonder if he was missing something. Was Mrs. Jenkins truly the villain in this story, or was there more to her than met the eye? In one particularly tense conversation, Mrs. Jenkins revealed that when she was younger, she had loved ducks just as much as Harold did. But after a series of unfortunate events, she had become jaded. She had lost her sense of wonder for the world around her, and now, all she could see were the rules and the need for order. Harold, who had always prided himself on his ability to see the best in people, found himself torn. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't just a bureaucrat trying to ruin his life. She was a woman who had lost something along the way, something that Harold had held onto all these years. This realization changed everything for him. It wasn't just about fighting Mrs. Jenkins, it was about showing her the value of compassion, of rediscovering the things that made life worth living. As the battle over the ducks raged on, the once peaceful neighborhood began to split into factions. Some neighbors sided with Harold, supporting his right to feed the ducks and protect the wildlife in the area. Others, led by Mrs. Jenkins, believed that Harold's actions were disrupting the community's peace. The once friendly streets were now filled with whispers and debates, and Harold began to feel the emotional toll of being at the center of it all. The weight of the conflict weighed heavily on Harold's heart. He had always been a man of principle, but this battle was different. It wasn't just about rules, it was about human nature, about the fragility of community, and about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. As Harold walked through the neighborhood, he felt the eyes of his neighbors on him, some sympathetic, some judgmental. He wasn't just fighting for the ducks anymore, he was fighting for his own place in this community, his right to make a difference. But amidst the turmoil, Harold found strength in the support of those who stood with him. He realized that even in the face of adversity, compassion could unite people. The more he stood firm in his beliefs, the more he saw the community coming together, united by a shared understanding of the importance of preservation. Slowly, Harold's fight became a catalyst for change, reminding everyone that sometimes, the smallest actions could spark the biggest movements. As the days went on, the conflict between Harold and Mrs. Jenkins reached new heights. But one morning, fate played its hand in the most unexpected way. Harold was walking along the pond when he saw Mrs. Jenkins standing by the water's edge, staring intently at the ducks. Her expression was not one of triumph or disdain, but one of quiet contemplation. Harold paused, unsure whether this was another confrontation or a moment of truce. "Harold, I never thought I'd say this," Mrs. Jenkins began, her voice softer than usual. "But I saw something today. One of those little ducklings, the ones you feed, they're so fragile. And I watched them huddle together, under the wings of their mother, trying to stay safe. It reminded me of a time when I was a child. I used to come to this very pond, with my father, to watch the ducks. We fed them too, until one day the pond dried up, and all the ducks vanished." Harold was taken aback. For the first time, he saw Mrs. Jenkins not as a rule enforcer, but as a person. She wasn't just fighting for order, she was fighting her own buried pain, memories of a simpler time she could never get back. The unexpected twist in the story was that Mrs. Jenkins wasn't simply an antagonist, she was a person who had once loved nature deeply, only to have it stripped away by life's harsh realities. In that moment, Harold realized that the battle for the ducks wasn't just a conflict about rules, it was a conflict about the preservation of something much deeper, something that connected all of them. As the battle over the ducks continued, Harold began to notice that the neighborhood, once a close-knit community, was now divided. The once friendly streets became battlegrounds of opinions. On one side were those who believed in Harold's cause, the preservation of nature, the protection of wildlife, and the importance of compassion. On the other side were those who sided with Mrs. Jenkins, valuing order and rules above all else. The debates escalated into heated arguments. Neighbors stopped speaking to one another, once warm greetings now replaced with cold stares. Harold, who had always been a man of peace, found himself caught in the crossfire. He had never imagined that feeding ducks could create such a rift in his community. What started as an innocent act of kindness had turned into a divisive issue. In the midst of this turmoil, Harold's heart grew heavy. He had always believed in the power of unity, the idea that communities could come together to solve problems. But now, that very community seemed to be unraveling before his eyes. Yet, as the emotional strain mounted, something inside him refused to give up. He reminded himself that the true battle wasn't about defeating Mrs. Jenkins, it was about reminding people of the values that united them, the things that really mattered in life: compassion, love for nature, and respect for each other's differences. One afternoon, as Harold was sitting by the pond, he received an unexpected call. It was from his old colleague, Sarah, a former environmental lawyer. She had heard about his ongoing struggle with Mrs. Jenkins and the HOA. Sarah's voice was urgent as she spoke, explaining that the fight for the ducks had grown beyond just local bylaws, it had become a matter of national importance. The ducks Harold had been feeding were part of a federally protected species, and the HOA's attempts to ban feeding them might have legal consequences. Harold listened, astonished. He had never realized how much was at stake. What had started as a simple act of kindness was now a legal battle that could have far-reaching consequences. As Sarah explained the implications, Harold's sense of duty deepened. This wasn't just about him and Mrs. Jenkins anymore, it was about the law, about protecting something far greater than their petty squabbles. The law, once a distant concept for Harold, now felt personal. The fight for the ducks had become a fight for justice. Harold realized that the laws meant to protect wildlife were not just bureaucratic red tape, they were tools for ensuring the survival of species that played a vital role in the ecosystem. He wasn't just defending ducks, he was defending the integrity of the natural world itself. And in doing so, he was becoming a guardian of something far larger than himself. As the weeks passed, the battle grew more intense. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't backing down. In fact, she seemed more determined than ever to rid the neighborhood of the ducks. She continued her crusade, posting flyers warning about the dangers of feeding wildlife, using scare tactics and half-truths to manipulate the community. She even began to gather evidence against Harold, hoping to force him into submission. But Harold, with the help of his neighbors who had come to support him, refused to be intimidated. He knew this fight wasn't just for him, it was for the ducks, for nature, and for the community that had once been united. The final confrontation came when Harold and his supporters presented their case to the HOA board. Armed with evidence of the ducks' protected status and the legal implications of the HOA's actions, they made their stand. The room was tense, the air thick with anticipation as Harold spoke with passion about the importance of preservation, about the legacy they would leave for future generations. As the meeting drew to a close, Harold felt a sense of pride. The community had come together, united not just by a common cause, but by a shared understanding of the importance of standing up for what was right. And in that moment, Harold realized that the outcome of this fight wasn't just about the ducks, it was about the kind of community they wanted to be. It was about teaching the next generation the value of compassion, of standing up for the things that mattered, and of preserving the natural beauty that surrounded them. In the weeks following the HOA's decision, the neighborhood began to heal. The division that had once torn the community apart slowly started to mend. More residents came to see the importance of protecting the ducks and their habitat, and the once controversial act of feeding them became a symbol of unity. The HOA, realizing the weight of their decision, voted to designate the marshland as a protected area where residents could legally feed the ducks without fear of fines. The victory was bittersweet. Mrs. Jenkins, though defeated, didn't relent easily. She continued to argue her position, but her influence waned as the truth became clear. The marsh, once a site of division, was now a symbol of community triumph. Harold, now regarded as a hero by many, stood by the pond once more, watching the ducks swim peacefully. The pond was no longer just a place for feeding ducks, it had become a sanctuary, a reminder that even the smallest actions could lead to significant change. Years later, the neighborhood would hold an annual festival in honor of the ducks, with food trucks, conservation booths, and educational activities for children. The ducks had become a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of nature and the strength of a community united for a common cause. Harold's legacy lived on, not just in the pond, but in the hearts of the people he had inspired. And though Mrs. Jenkins had long since moved away, her role in the story remained, a reminder that sometimes, the greatest battles are fought not with force, but with the courage to stand up for what is right.